We now have Dr. Michael Rubin. Welcome, Dr. Rubin, who's a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. He also regularly teaches classes at sea to deployed US Navy and Marine units about Middle East conflicts, culture, terrorism, and the Horn of Africa. A former Pentagon official, Dr. Rubin has lived in post-revolutionary Iran, Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq, and he spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. He's the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics. And we really appreciate your joining us today. And we hope the lights don't flicker and the Zoom connection stays strong. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's hard to follow Max, and I want to just say how grateful I am for his remarks and how meaningful they were to me. Before I start talking about the Middle East, I'm reminded of an old Russian joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who says, today we have war, we have famine, we have chaos, the economy is horrible, things couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, 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 they can always get worse. So as I talk about the Middle East, I'm going to give a bit of a Middle Eastern optimistic talk. I want to start by talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. You know, that seems to be a focus of the current administration's diplomacy right now, at least when it comes to the Middle East. And I don't want to engage in a partisan discussion, but what I want to do is, as an analyst, look at some of the issues which I don't think the newspapers are covering. First of all, when we look at the Iranian political dynamics, oftentimes they're described in the United States in terms of hardliners versus reformers. First, we've got to recognize that that's only one extreme of the political spectrum of all Iranians, but Iran isn't a democracy. So all these factions are relative. There tends to be a tendency among those who promote diplomacy, however, to believe that somehow, if we engage with Iran, if we provide financial incentives, that somehow this will help the reformers, especially as we come to the forthcoming election this summer. There's a couple problems with this, however. First of all, when it comes to understanding Iran and its various factions, sometimes it's useful to see them in a game of good cop, bad cop, where the major disputes are about style rather than about the substance of their policies. And that's not simply a theory. The fact of the matter is, the reformers don't control security or the economy inside Iran. So all of the issues with which we have concern, the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, regional terrorism, that's all within the hands of the unelected bodies. And in fact, if we go back through history, most of the advances in the nuclear program actually occurred during periods of reformist control, not that the reformists had any ability to impact the nuclear policy. So to talk, for example, to the foreign minister of Iran about the nuclear program is about as effective as someone talking to the US Department of Agriculture about our nuclear program. The president and the foreign minister simply have no control over that portfolio. Now, I'm a history nerd. My doctorate's in Iranian history. And admittedly, that means I just get paid to predict the past. And my friends would say I only get that right about half the time. But when it comes to Iran, it's important to understand what the Iran-Iraq war did in society. Not only is that the origin of the split between the hardliners and the reformers, The hardliners in Persian, they don't use the term hardline, they use the term principalists, those who abide by the principles of the Islamic Revolution because they returned to Tehran after the war. And they saw that all the so-called reformers had gotten involved in business. And so the hardliners actually have the mantle of anti-corruption. We can't project our own vision onto them. But the other thing that's important is the Revolutionary Guard was empowered during this war. And in 1988, when Ayatollah Khomeini gave a speech announcing a ceasefire, they didn't want to go back into the barracks. So without any moral equivalence, what they did is they took their equivalent of the US Army Corps of Engineers and they merged it with Bechtel and KBR and Halliburton and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and Walmart and ExxonMobil and Chevron. And that conglomerate, which the IRGC controls, their equivalents, controls about 40% of the Iranian economy today. Put this another way, the Revolutionary Guard's business income is about 10 times what its official budget is. So even if the Iranians had an epiphany that the Revolutionary Guard were terrorists and they were going to take their budget to zero, we'd be facing a problem that the Revolutionary Guard are financially independent. Now, the reason why this is important is if you give financial incentives to Iran, in effect, you're pumping money not into the wallets of ordinary Iranians, but actually into those that sponsor terrorism. Now, this past December, I spent some time in southern Lebanon, in Nabatea, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. And when I was talking to people in Nabatea, they were saying, you know, things have never been this bad for us. Because of the Lebanese financial crisis, at first, Hezbollah stopped paying its people in dollars and started paying them in Lebanese pounds, which are virtually worthless. And then they cut the salaries. And so Hezbollah was figuring out that 90% of its members were only in it for the privileges and not for the ideology. We risk snatching defeat from the jaws of victory if we allow these groups to re-resource themselves. Now, why are the Iranians so engaged? I think it comes down to money. I'm talking to you from Baghdad, and one of the interesting things with Shiite politicians, and I don't just meet with the pro-American politicians, I'll meet with militiamen as well. They will openly acknowledge that they now pay more money to Iran than Iran pays to them because Iran has been so financially constrained. The question then comes, if you give Iran that financial relief, can you get it to the ordinary people? Now, I'm not saying that we should strangle them the way that Iraq was strangled, but at the very least, we need to have a real conversation about how we do things so that we don't make the mistakes of the recent past. Now, when it comes to Iran's nuclear program, the problem isn't that Iran with a nuclear weapon would be suicidal. I don't happen to believe that they are suicidal. The problem is that Iran with a nuclear weapon could be terminally ill. Now, here we go into a few different problems. We often talk, like I said, about hardliners versus reformers. But one thing we spend billions of dollars on American intelligence. One of the things we don't understand well is what we don't know. One of the things we don't know are the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard. How many people simply join for the privilege versus how many people are those true believers, like the 10% of Hezbollah? And what we find is that most Iranians simply are apathetic, but you do have screening for ideology, and those that are in control of the nuclear program would be the ones who control the nuclear weapon should Iran develop it. Now, here's the problem. To make an Eastern Europe metaphor, what happens if you have an uprising like Romania had in 1989, where there was an uprising, instead of the security forces cracking down, they joined in, and then on Christmas Day, 1989, Ceausescu was in front of the firing squad. What if you have a situation like that in Iran? But you have the Revolutionary Guard, the true ideologues, having nuclear weapons. If you know that the regime is going to fall within 24 hours, why not launch? Because you have nothing to lose. That's the nightmare deterrence problem. Now, there's also looming chaos because the supreme leader is 81 years old. He's had cancer that's been publicly acknowledged inside Iran on his own Twitter feed. He's partially paralyzed from a previous assassination attempt. What's the next supreme leader going to be like? Oftentimes, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it's the foreign policy crisis that comes from left field that ends up defining the administration, not what they see coming. Now, very quickly, I'm not just worried about Iran. There's a Turkish joke now about how, because of all these purges in Turkey, one of these political prisoners goes into the prison library and he asks the librarian for a book. And the librarian apologizes profusely and says, "I'm sorry, we don't have books. We only have their authors." The fact of the matter is, Turkey today has fundamentally changed from what it was a decade or two ago. One statistic, which comes from the Turkish Interior Ministry, that I like to point out just to show how fundamentally different Turkey is today, is that there's been a 1,400% increase in the murder rate of women since Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power. 1/3 of the marriages in Eastern Turkey are child marriages. We've got a serious problem, and Turkey seems to be exporting its ideology across Africa, Europe, and so forth. I would argue that 21st century Turkey is the equivalent to Islamic radicalism, what Saudi Arabia was in the 20th century. And we're too busy gearing our policy to Turkey to what we wish it would be, rather than what it's become. I'll just finish by talking very briefly about what's going on in Jordan and then open the floor to questions and answers. What we saw in Jordan was truly shocking. And it should highlight, just as a mental game, how different the Middle East would be if either the Jordanian monarchy fell, or for that matter, if the Saudi monarchy, all of its warts included, fell. I mean, we need to recognize that we have to focus on policy, not just what it is, but imagine those worst case scenarios. Now, here's the problem of what's going on in Jordan. And thankfully, I don't think it's as much of a problem as perhaps the headline said. First of all, it's hard. What we did not see was any military members really being arrested. And it's hard to have a coup if you don't have the military. I think what we're basically seeing is not only a family feud, but a reaction to the aloofness of King Abdullah II. King Abdullah II is a bit like Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union was. He's much more popular outside the country than he is inside the country. He's still often referred to in Jordan as Al-Inglisi, the Englishman. And the problem is, he's married to a Palestinian wife. And that's great if the crown prince is half Palestinian, half East Bank Jordanian. You can imagine the symbolism of this for Jordan. But if you're an East Banker, what you're seeing is your traditional position in what you consider to be your country being eroded away. Former Crown Prince Hamza also did a much better job than Al-Inglisi at sitting down with the sheikhs and simply drinking his tea and showing that he was listening to them. In effect, he had a much more astute cultural ear. Now, the lesson here isn't to ensure that members of the royal family are purged in the way that we had a purge in Saudi Arabia. The lesson looking forward with Jordan is we've got to convince the King of Jordan and the Crown Prince of Jordan that they've got to do a lot more local politics, that it's not enough to sit aloof in the palace complex. Now, let me just end as an American optimist, as opposed to a Russian optimist. You know, it's amazing living through what we are living through now. When we look at the peace which has been breaking out in the region. You know, with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, these pieces aren't simply cold pieces like with Egypt and to some extent with the people of Jordan. They're the first true warm pieces and partnerships we've seen. And when it comes to Sudan, this symbolically is hugely important. The sight of the three no's: no negotiations with Israel, no recognition. And I forget what the third no is, I'm sorry. At any rate, even when I'm in Iraq and when I'm in Lebanon, since the war in Iraq, 40%, since 2003, 40% of Iraqis have been born. It's a completely different country. And most young Iraqis, even in southern Lebanon, most southern Lebanese, they might say, we don't necessarily like the Israelis, but why shouldn't we have relations with them? The government's not caught up. The Iranian-backed militias aren't caught up. But I'm starting to see a sea change in the region, which is healthy. And even in Iran, Iranians are more cosmopolitan than the people around them. The only time I was ever asked whether I was Jewish when I was in Iran was someone who came up to me at University of Tehran, said, Rubin, that's a Jewish name. Are you Jewish? I said, yes. And she said, I know it's impolite to ask, but I thought you were. And I went to kindergarten with someone who's Jewish. And maybe you'd like to meet her so she could show you the Jewish community. The point of this is, let's keep in mind the problems, the regime. But throughout the region, the younger generation, there seems to be a much greater tolerance. But that said, we can never let our guard down when it comes to incitement, and for all the reasons which Max said. Because sometimes if we don't answer incitement, then the worst can truly happen. And certainly there's leadership in Iran and elsewhere which would like that to repeat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those really interesting comments. Let me just remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, please use the raise hand function. I'm going to start with trying to take the optimistic side, but maybe not totally, and asking a little bit about the US military presence across the Middle East. There's been a lot of conversation about a reduction in that presence in a number of different places with a renewed focus on Asia for the US military presence. How do you see that unfolding in terms of the balance of power in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, I'm going to put back on my cap as a history nerd. What's important to recognize is that most leaders in the region have been leaders in the region for decades. So let's go back to, I think it was Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, who in 1968 gave the East of Suez speech, in which he said the British Empire, against the backdrop of a devaluation of the British pound and a financial crisis, the British Empire would no longer project force east of the Suez Canal. And it was as the British pulled out that the Americans took over a lot of their bases, for example, in Bahrain, Oman, the Emirates. Now, the reason I bring this up is when, for example, President Obama talked about a pivot to Asia. That made huge strategic sense. And it's a policy which was continued by Secretary of State Pompeo and is being continued by President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken. But when you're in the Middle East, what you're hearing is not a pivot to Asia, but a pivot away from us. And so the key thing isn't having a perpetual military force throughout the region, but psychologically addressing this psychosis that the United States is abandoning us, and therefore we have to make accommodation with countries like Russia or China or the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's what we need to be doing a much greater focus on. That said, just very quickly, we also have to be mindful that vacuums come back to bite us. The issue shouldn't have perpetual forces stood in, but rather, how do we fill the vacuum? My personal policy advocacy would be when Emmanuel Macron travels, when Vladimir Putin travels, when Benjamin Netanyahu travels, oftentimes, and when Recep Tayyip Erdogan travels, oftentimes they travel not just with a plane load of aides and press, but a plane load of businessmen. I would like to see the face of American policy in the region not be the CIA and not be the Pentagon. And let's face it, for all we talk about putting diplomacy first, it's hard for diplomats to do their job if security parameters force them to stay behind embassy walls. The region will stabilize when Americans are going back and forth in a way that, frankly, we're starting to in the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Hear me? Is anyone going to ask a next question?
Yes, I'm sorry. You were a little bit interrupted on my Zoom. I apologize. So Rachel, next question, please.
The next question is from Bob Sugarman.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rubin. I'm going to ask a somewhat pessimistic question. Let's assume that the talks in Vienna fall apart. The JCPOA is history. Iran continues to enrich uranium, open its centrifuges, do work on its heavy water reactor in Iraq. What does the rest of the world, the United States, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Emiratis, et cetera, and so forth, do in that scenario?
Well, I'm sorry, the internet is starting to become a little bit unstable, but let me know in the chat function if for any reason you can't hear me.
Okay.
What I would say, first of all, is that there is a history of maximum pressure working. It worked to release the American hostages in 1981. And it also worked to end the Iran-Iraq war in 1988, when Ayatollah Khomeini got on the radio and he said, it's like drinking a chalice of poison, but I have no choice to drink from this cup if I want the revolution to survive. Now, when it comes to Saudi Arabia and the regional states, I would say it's hugely important if we want them to be, if we want nuclear talks with Iran to be successful, to bring the regional states in to address their concerns. Otherwise, we're going to be accused, and this is what happens in the region, of simply living an effete life without any accountability for failure of these agreements. And it's a guarantee that not only will agreements fail, but you might have some of these states start working unilaterally to counter Iran's program. And that's a way, that's something which is going to lead to greater instability in the region. And we forget that countries in the region have interests and they have agency. So just before, because for example, we want Saudi Arabia to stop bombing Yemen. They're not bombing Yemen because the United States told them to. They're bombing that Yemen because they think that Yemen poses an existential threat to their country. Likewise, Saudi Arabia isn't opposing Iran because they just don't like Iran. They're opposing Iran because they feel a distinct threat. And we have no magic wand to address that. I would also argue that we will gain a great deal of confidence in the region if we negotiate any future nuclear deal as a treaty rather than as a political agreement. If we fail to do that, then we're simply entering another period of whiplash foreign policy. And that's not healthy for the Democrats, for the Republicans, or for the United States. And just a short answer to Robert, Saudi Arabia would easily buy an off-the-shelf nuclear weapon as well from Russia, from North Korea, from Pakistan, and that's not something we want.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. The next question, please.
The next question is from Richard Stone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I think a lot of us are very impressed with the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has a uniquely intense relationship to these issues. And from the time that he went to the United States Congress in that extraordinary moment that I think he thoroughly realized was something he had to do in spite of enormous risk, I think we've all understood that Israel ultimately might decide that it had to take care of the Iranian issue itself if the rest of the world, including the United States, did not. I'd love to hear your ideas about what possibly could happen if either Netanyahu or a successor decides that Israel has to take a radical move in order to protect itself at unique danger in the Iranian problem.
Okay, it's a great question. First of all, not to delve too much into Israeli politics, but there is a broad security consensus dating back to 2000, 2001 that transcends the person of Netanyahu or the party of Netanyahu. Both, generally speaking, left, right, and center in Israel tend to agree on security policy. And again, that's very healthy when you don't have those partisan divisions. Oftentimes, those who are criticizing Israeli politicians who are criticizing Israeli security posture the most are doing so in the United States or in Europe because they failed to cultivate their own constituencies on this inside Israel itself. Now, to directly answer your question, Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq. Israeli pilots aren't suicidal. So even if they went in with stealth, they wouldn't be able to return with stealth once they dropped their ordnance. The Iranians would know that they were there. Now, this raises a few issues. First of all, they would likely cooperate with some of their Gulf allies for logistics. Second of all, before they attack the nuclear infrastructure, they would have to go after Iranian command and control and Iranian anti-aircraft batteries and Iranian airstrips. You would also have to hit the Iranian nuclear program sites more than once to ensure that their destruction. I'm less worried about the Iranian sites actually which are buried underground because you don't have to destroy the sites. You only have to destroy their entrances. That said, I've talked to Air Force generals and planners, US Air Force generals and planners, and as a back of a napkin calculation, they suggested that this would be at least 1,300 sorties. So we're not talking about the 1981 strike in Osirak or the 2000 strike in Deir ez-Zor, Syria. That said, Israel could likely do the job. More German submarines than the German Navy does. And Israel certainly has demonstrated its ability to operate in other more asymmetrical means. For example, presumably with Stuxnet, some of the high-profile assassinations of nuclear officials and so forth. How would Iran respond? Iran would respond by a barrage from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, or by a drone barrage. What this actually does, however, is it creates a disincentive for Hezbollah to attack Israel now. Because if Hezbollah or anyone in Lebanon starts attacking Israel, Israel could simply assume in for a penny, in for a pound, as long as we're suffering these drone barrages and so forth, missile strikes, we might as well finish the job we need to do. And so I do think Israel has the capability. I would say that one easy thing the United States could do to show that we are interested in diplomacy. I'm being a Navy nerd now. I've never served, but I've spent more than a year over the last decade on US aircraft carriers and amphibious assault vessels. One of the things about aircraft carriers is it takes 26 knots of wind speed to launch one of our F-18s or any aircraft, even with the catapult. Now, there's two ways to do that. You either speed up or you turn into the wind. The problem with the Persian Gulf is it's very narrow and it's very shallow. It's never deeper than 300 feet. And you have a lot of islands, so international waterways are hard to stay out of. At the same time, you have all these Iranian small boats. And so the Iranian sort of strategy would be to swarm our aircraft carriers in order to cause damage or cripple them. Now, before 1991, we actually never sent aircraft carriers into the Persian Gulf for this reason. But like I said, east of Suez, pivot away from us, not just to Asia, there's a psychological component to this. When I talk to any American admiral and ask them, what posture should we have if we want the Iranians to take our diplomacy seriously and to understand that they can't screw around with us or Israel or anyone else? The answer is remove American aircraft carriers from the Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean. The reason for that is if you put our aircraft carriers 400 miles into the northern Indian Ocean, we can strike at Iran and Iran can't hit back. And that's something that worries them a great deal. So there's a lot of nuance here, which I don't think is entering our political debate. If you believe that nuclear negotiations are a good thing, and certainly there's a range of opinion on this, then let's understand that every strategy has a not only a diplomatic component, but an informational, military, and an economic one as well, and maximize our leverage to the fullest extent so it doesn't go to that scenario which Richard is mentioning.
Thank you. Rahel, next question, please.
The next question is from Mindy Stein of Emuna.
Mindy, can you unmute?
I'm trying.
No, okay. There we go.
There I am. I wanted you to talk, thank you for the presentation. I wanted you to talk about the China-Iran deal. Doesn't the $400 billion deal with China give an escape to Iran, which will diminish the impact of the sanctions anyway, the maximum campaign, the maximum pressure campaign?
Mindy, it's a great question. And here I think that both Iran and China are making a mistake. First of all, I'm not sure that there's any there, simply because neither the Iranians nor the Chinese are actually presenting any of the agreements beyond this press release. Beyond that, there's a history in Iran where Iran always turns to third parties in order to relieve pressure from those countries they think are victimizing it. So when the British and the Russians were in Iran in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Iranians first turned to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which actually formed Iran's first modern military. And then they turned to the Belgians to reform the finance. And then they turned to the Americans in 1912 because they thought that the Americans were a disinterested party in Iran and wouldn't interfere in Iranian politics. Okay, so now, for whatever reason, the United States is more deeply involved with Iran and the Iranians are turning to China. The problem is in each case, believe it or not, the Belgians, the Russians before, the Americans, the Iranians feel that the countries which have interfered or they've turned to have exploited Iran. And so they're very prickly and xenophobic. Now, remember, the root of anti-Americanism in Iran isn't really that 1953 coup. First of all, we occupied Iran during World War II to have a back channel supply route to the Soviet Union. And in 1953, our co-conspirators were the Islamic clergy because they were afraid of the Iranian communists. So when we apologize to the Islamic Republic for that, we're actually apologizing to our co-conspirators. The real root of anti-Americanism in Iran is in the late 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, when American companies, Bell Helicopters, Pepsi Cola, Ross Perot's EDS, entered Iran. All of their employees had diplomatic immunity. And so an Iranian was killed by a drunk driver, no recourse. And this has led the Iranians to be very, very prickly about the privileges granted to foreigners. Do you really think that the Chinese are going to subordinate themselves to Iranian law? The answer is no. And so this is going to cause tension. At the same time, while a lot of people will blame sanctions for Iran's economic failing, the reality is that the responsibility for Iran's economic failings is Iranian economic mismanagement. Because you have no commercial law, you have the Revolutionary Guard controlling 40% of the economy, distorting the economy, operating above the law, and you have competing power centers and so forth. And so if the Chinese try to invest any serious money into Iran, they're going to have a situation where everyone inside Iran is going to be trying to pick at them and revise deals in order to sort of get as much profit as possible without doing much. So honestly, I see this deal as a train wreck. And I think both the Iranians and especially the Chinese recognize this, which is why it's one thing to talk about investing money and quite another thing to actually do it. When I talk to European companies like Total Oil and so forth, just to give one example, in the past, when there would be announcements that they were investing in Iran, when you talk to them privately, they would say, hey, look, we're not stupid enough to put all this money in Iran. We just want to have our foot in the door. Should things change, that we have the advantage. But at this point, no one wants to do serious business with Iran because they don't trust the Iranians. That doesn't mean we can be complacent, but I wouldn't frame the problem of China in Iran in the same way that the New York Times did.
Thank you very much. Rachel, next question, please.
The next question is from Malcolm Hoenlein.
Yeah, thank you. This is really an amazing presentation. And we thank the Iraqis for making the connection possible. I wanted to ask you about the role of the minorities. Both you were in Erbil, I know, in the past, and whether the Kurdish situation is changing and the minorities who make up the majority in Iran, what is happening in terms of the unrest amongst the Azeris, the Baluchis, et cetera, and will any of this play out in the upcoming election?
Okay, excellent question, Malcolm. Remember, only about 50% of Iran is ethnically Persian. Even the supreme leader is an ethnic Azeri. The Kurds and the Baluchis have two strikes against them because not only are they ethnic minorities, but they're sectarian minorities as well. They're Sunnis. And they are the most discriminated against because of that inside Iran. What I would say briefly is two things. First of all, I don't judge countries by our diplomacy and our diplomatic statements. I actually think religious liberty is the best canary in the coal mine. I'd much rather, when a rogue regime reforms, you can tell whether it's sincere or not in how it treats its Jews, how it treats its Christians, how it treats its Baha'is and Ahmadis and Yazidis. This, by the way, is one of the reasons I'm so concerned about Turkey today. At the same time, here's what I would say. What frustrates me is whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. In the United States, we can't get enough of going over the most minute poll data. And we fact check every politician. And yet when it comes to Iran, which actively uses voter participation as their as a sign of their legitimacy. We take their statistics at their word. So they say we have 70% voter turnout, and the New York Times reports that, or Washington Post. And most journalists aren't allowed out of the Capitol. Judging, I mean, I lived in Tehran. Post-revolution, they used to call me in Persian, Pesari Shaitani Bozorg, which means son of the great Satan. But so I recognize the backdrops where these journalists are. And talking about Iranian politics across the country, from northern Tehran, is like talking about what's going on in Watertown, New York, from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It just doesn't work. What I hear from my Kurdish contacts, from my Baluchi contacts, and so forth, is that oftentimes voter turnout in the peripheral regions is only about 10 or 15%. And so we've got to start treating Iran with the same skepticism that we treat our country. Dictatorships should never be given more of a benefit of a doubt than democracy should be. And transparency matters. So let me just leave the answer to that question there.
Thank you. Rachel, next question, please.
The last question.
I see Max's hand is up, not electronically, but on the screen.
Okay, sure. Max, please.
Max, could you unmute yourself?
Can you unmute Max, Rachel?
I'm trying.
Max, you need to press the unmute button. Bottom left of your screen, maybe.
Can you tell me, is the United States going to be a steadfast partner with Israel? And who are Israel's true supporters in Europe today?
My own gut reaction is that Israel is caught as a political football in our foreign policy debate. And that's very, very unhealthy for long-term US-Israeli relations. I think that's what we need to work on most. And frankly, I think that's what the Israelis need to work on most. Is Netanyahu more comfortable with the Republicans? Sure, which is all the reason why he needs to focus his energy on the Democrats and the progressive base, especially to counter the type of propagandistic nonsense and anti-Semitism we see coming from some of the BDS supporters and so forth. Within Europe, I would defer to others, but my gut reaction is that countries which have emerged from communism, Poland, Czechia, Romania, tend to have a better appreciation of what freedom and liberty mean than, unfortunately, some countries in Western Europe. And they will recognize Israel's strength through that lens.
Thank you. Well, Rachel, our final question, please.
I'll just jump in. Thank you for that, Dianne. Michael, in our remaining few moments, you touched on Jordan a little bit, and I wonder if you can just touch on a little bit more. In the wake of the game of chicken a few weeks ago, when with the whole Jordanian airspace issue and Netanyahu unable to fly to the UAE and the Crown Prince unable to come into the old city, there was a whole line of talk about how Jordan is not as relevant as it used to be, and that the Jordanians are overrated and the royal family is overrated. That was sort of coming out of certain circles in Israel. And I wonder what your take is on that, particularly in the wake of the coup. And again, we're pretty much out of time. So if you could zoom through that.
I'll be very brief. People like David Schenker at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who recently left as Assistant Secretary of State, are true Jordanian experts. I'm not. What I would argue is we've had periods of tension between Israel and Jordan, but at a security level, they still have a very strong relationship and a crucial relationship and a trusted relationship. I don't honestly think that if the Israelis knew that there was something serious in the works in Jordan, that they wouldn't alert King Abdullah II the way, frankly, they had alerted his father at times of crisis. Sometimes the rhetoric we have coming out of Israel is more in the political sphere, and it's more posturing, but behind the scenes, I think the security services in both states understand just how valuable the partnership is, the mutual partnership is, and I want to thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank you for your comments. We really appreciate it. Safe travels, and thank you everybody for attending.